Evening, folks. So facilities management. It's one of those. All my facilities management in-jokes aren't going to work on you guys, which is a real problem. It dawned on me about 10 minutes ago, so I'm going to have to see how this all plays out. But I'm guessing that some of you have got facilities managers in your organisations, or if you haven't, you've got that function represented in different ways. It might be a bunch of people doing it, it might be one person with a different title, but it's basically we're responsible for your organisational workspace, and we're responsible for the services that go with it. But for me, the primary thing that needs thinking about is the space. So before we get into what the session's about, just to kind of position why I'm stood here talking. So natural scientist by first degree, an accidental FM. Everybody in FM at this point, nobody leaves school with A-levels going, when I grow up, I want to be a facilities manager, because it's just not sexy enough, and there's probably not enough money in either. So you find yourself, by hook or by crook, in this industry. I was temping in a mailroom for Orange in the Northeast, and I was a youth worker at the time, and I discovered that mailrooms are part of office services, and office services are part of facilities management, and all of a sudden there's this whole thing that sits behind an organisation. So I spent some time working for Orange, got outsourced to Johnson Controls. If you've ever been outsourced or 2P transfers, you'll know that that's a really enjoyable experience and doesn't affect the people involved at all. Whilst I was on that journey, I did a master's degree in facilities management at Hallam, and I worked out there that I was actually a teacher. I probably always had been a teacher, it's just now I had a topic that I could teach about. And that has led me since 2008 on a journey of kind of discovery, and where I am now is doing what I do at Hallam, but also in the final stages, they can take quite a while, of a doctorate. And the kind of the layman's title of my doctorate is what matters to people about workspace. And I kind of want you to hold that thought and just kind of ponder it. If you get bored of me or if your mind wanders, just have a think about what matters to people about workspace. And one thing that I'm really interested in as a facilities manager is, do provider and user perspectives differ? Do they differ in some ways but not in others? And so that's kind of where I've ended up, because principally I do believe that we can do stuff better. So it's interesting listening to Neil talk about kind of crossovers around agile and stuff like that. Yeah, there's definitely crossovers, but before we even get to that, or I certainly want to explore crossovers today, but before we even get to that, we're the function that will come up to you and say, yeah, we need to change the way your space is. We need you to do something different, or we need to move you, or we need to rearrange what you do, and you can't have what you did have, but you can have something else, and it's really good and really exciting. We're the function that does that to organisations on behalf of organisations. So it's a really, my guess is that you've all got a vested interest in workspace somehow, which is why I think it's really quite important. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of context and perspective, which is going to hopefully justify why I went about my doctoral research the way I went about it. And I'm basically just going to share with you, once I've told you all of that, and it's a bit of a story, but I'm going to share with you 3 key findings. And I'd love to hear your reflections. I've never spoken to an audience from this sort of professional background before, so it'll be lovely to hear whether this resonates with you or not. And we might talk about what implications might be quite quickly, but then hopefully, and if I speak quite quickly, we'll get into a conversation about your agile versus my agile, and what's that all about, and is there a crossover, is there a common ground that we should be striving for? Do you guys do space better than my typical kind of clients, I guess might be a way of putting it. Have you solved something because of what you culturally have become with agile that I haven't seen yet? So we can have hopefully an interesting conversation about it. So as a bit of a session, does that sound all right? Okay, right. So, bit of context. Who's that? Why have I got Winston as my first sort of slide? What did Winston say about space? Any famous quotes that spring to mind?
We define our space and it defines us.
Oh, look, there's a closet facilities manager in the room. Something like that. We shape our dwellings and thereafter they shape us. I should qualify, but I can't stand up there. Something gives me the fear. I think it's because I'm a short arse. I can't actually stand on this stage. It frightens me, so I'm going to stay down here. But yeah, we shape our dwellings and thereafter they shape us. And that was born out of the bombing of the House of Commons in the Second World War. And they were debating how to rebuild the House of Commons. Do we rebuild it the way it was, or do we rebuild it in a different configuration? And what Churchill was basically saying was, however that space is going to affect how we are. And there's this interrelationship between people and space. And they rebuilt it in an image of what it was before because they wanted that adversarial, debating, confrontational kind of style, which we probably love or hate at this point, you know? So, interesting starting point. Okay, so principally, I'm going to say, I believe quite passionately that space really does matter. And it matters in all sorts of ways. I'm interested in the sort of telltale signs that we see all around us about how much it matters. So stuff like this, how about that? Do you have a child who has done that? Or do you remember doing that? I do. I have one daughter, she's 4 years old. Do you know how old she was the first time she told me to get out? And I wasn't doing anything dodgy before you start. Right. You can always bounce in different ways, that bit. No, she was quite literally, 2 years old. She just went, Dad, don't come in. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? And I'm racking my brains going, what have I done to you that says that there's spatial stuff? And then when I was saying this to a different group, somebody said, yeah, but think about your car parking. Think about how it's always the parents' car on the driveway, and then when the kids get their first cars, when they're learning to drive, they don't get prime position. All of this hierarchical stuff, all of this spatial stuff is everywhere. It's all around us. And that really got me thinking. So, it's this idea that workspace matters. It matters to all sorts. Have a look at some of these headlines. You're going to see that Satan features quite strongly, particularly when we start talking about open plan. So, that's journalistic from The Guardian, Oliver Burkeman. That's a chapter from a book which is basically saying that modern-day workhouses, modern-day mills, call centres. That's Jeremy Paxman ranting. I've got a suspicion that Jeremy Paxman's just found out he's getting moved to open plan in his sort of temporary office that he occasionally visits to write a column for somebody. And that's a within industry blog site where somebody's basically sort of responding, Nigel Osland is responding to lots of these things and saying, is it all about this open plan stuff? What's going on here? So clearly people have got something to say about it. A lot of BBC journalists seem to have something to say about it, particularly since the move to Salford. And that's another that's an unproved theory of mine. I've got a funny feeling that they're ever so interested because everything changed for them. Might be wrong. But the next step on this is space isn't place. So we can talk about workspace and we can talk about workplace. What do you think the difference is? Hazard a guess? There is no right or wrong answer to this, by the way, because there's just different ways to look at it. But what would you say workspace was and what would you say workplace was?
I'd say workspace is my own little area that I've carved.
Okay.
And then workplace is the entire thing.
Okay, the hand that went up over there, were you going to say something similar? Or were you going to say something different? I don't know, there was a hand that went up, so. Okay, well that's the perfect starting point. And I can turn you to definitions within my sort of industry literature, which says workspace, workstation, work setting, it's that kind of bit that's near, and workplace is kind of the overall. So it's that kind of geographical, they're geographically related, and one is suited within the other, right? And that's kind of the way that the starting thinks, but I'm going to say something slightly different. I'm going to say that actually, and we're going back now to sort of 1970s kind of structuration theory. This is I've forgotten his name now, one of our most famous academics. I can't remember his name. Come back to me in a minute. So is this idea that space and place are qualitatively different and interrelated. Space is the geographical element, but place is when the people get involved and it comes to life with something else. So we can do it. One definition is to do that kind of interrelated distance piece, but there might be a more powerful way to think about this. So I might come back to that. Let me just find if I can find, yes, that's what I'm looking for. So kind of a proposition for you, not a particularly scientific and not a particularly accurate equation, but just something to think about. Space plus culture equals place. So in this respect, space is sort of quantitative, whereas place is much more qualitative. And I wonder if some of the reasons the industry is so kind of limited in some of its thinking, and we'll get onto this in a minute, is because they're focusing so much on this bit. And they want to transform this stuff, and they say that we're really important to this stuff, but we're not talking in those terms. This is all context still, just to paint a picture. I'm going to skip past that, I think, and I might come back to it in a wee while. So you end up at this place where, for an organisation, if you think back to Winston Churchill and his idea that we shape our dwellings and thereafter they shape us, a space for an organisation can kind of be two things. It can be a reflection of who you are, but it could also potentially be a catalyst for different things. And our industry, certainly that catalyst piece, that's part of our business card, right? Change your space, change your culture, and we'll help you do it, because there's a lot of money involved in this. A lot of furniture organisations, a lot of design organisations, a lot of organisational spaces that want you as clients within them are going to say, our space will help you be something different. And that really interests me, because Winston Churchill says, well, chicken and egg, which comes first? If you are always a representation of your space, how does that thing actually play out? So these are sorts of things going on in my mind as I'm kind of going, so how am I going to approach this research? What am I going to explore, and why am I going to explore it? And fundamentally, if you step back and look at all the literature, we design things to achieve particular outcomes. And when you look at all of those outcomes, for me, they kind of fall into those four rather convenient C's. It's funny, isn't it, how you always get your little acronyms lined up in a row. So I've got 4 C's. But we can design for control, we can design for commodity, organisational value, it might be brand, it might be buildings as resources. We can design for commodity, we can design for change. So we can do big scale changes to get people trying to work differently, or we can actually design spaces that make people be different every day of their working lives. Because, for example, we can take their desk away from them and say, because we're expecting you to work in a much more agile way, you're always going to be changing, and we want you to think about that constantly. Or we can design for community, or we can design for lots of those things together. But for me, everything sort of fits. Everything that we might try and do fits into those 4 C's, and they don't always complement each other. And it's quite interesting to try and get under the skin of what we're designing for. So, who's this? Second pub quiz question of the evening. We've had Winston. Who do you think this guy is? You are a bright bunch. You're the brightest audience I've ever had, and I'm not just saying that. We don't normally get Socrates on the first, or often the second. Okay, so this is Socrates, who said something like this. And so I kind of wanted to try and do something which was beyond the way the industry goes about stuff. I wanted to try something different, to try and, if I ask a different question in a different way, does it yield different answers? And it was that kind of starting point for me. So this is where I get to do some shameless matrix stills, because I do like them for presentations. It's this bit: what if we don't know as much as we think we know as an industry, right? And what if we only ask particular things in particular ways, we only get particular responses? And what if there's a completely different way of thinking about this? So how about we try and park all of those things as much as we can, because you can never truly park stuff, because you've always got bias in there somewhere. But how about we try and do that? And for me, my hero, Morpheus, it's that kind of idea. There's always been something kind of nibbling away at the back of my mind about there's got to be a better way to do this. Surely we're not thinking about this as full as we think we are or quite right. So what might we do about it? So the research was an attempt to step beyond that kind of industry thinking, to be as open as possible and to see where it went. So this is now, that's the context bit. You still with me? You still interested, or shall I get my coat? Am I all right? Okay, I'll keep going. Right, so that got me to, okay, how am I going to do this thing? So, as I said earlier, the layman's title for what I set about trying to understand was what matters to people about workspace. Now, I've already declared to you that I'm interested in both providers, facilities managers, designers, architects, that kind of cluster of people, and also users. And obviously, all providers have to be users by default as well, because we all work somewhere. So I'm interested in these differences to see where it gets us. Now, what we've got here is we've also got photos of my 2 case studies that I accessed in order to do my research. So I'll tell you briefly about them now whilst I remember. So the top one is anonymised to Propco. They're a property consultancy based down in London, and they work in an agile way, to use that term I think for the second time in my presentation. They don't have assigned desks, they have team clusters. So I'm starting to tell you now about agile kind of in my industry. They have a variety of different work settings which they are empowered to choose. They might go to them autonomously, they might book them in advance, they might go to them reactively or opportunistically. Very high quality space, very high quality fit out, very slick, designed with commodity in mind, designed so that when a client walks in, they kind of go, this isn't ostentatious, but this is a firm that knows what they're doing. They're trying to convey a brand message with their workspace. The other space is a co-working space, quite a famous co-working space down in London, that if you know your co-working spaces, we've got co-working spotters at the back of the room now, trying to suss out where it is. If you know your co-working spaces, this is an international brand, and this is ShareCo down in London by my anonymisation. What can I say about this? It's a very disarming space. Part of the design ethic of the architectural company that designed it was, we want to actually disarm you as you walk in. We want to challenge your expectations of what a workspace is, because we want you working differently inside them. Now, interestingly, that's an agile workspace as well, but it never talks about being agile. It talks about a lot of other features, which I'm going to share with you a little bit later, but it doesn't talk about we're an agile workspace and we employ these new ways of working or whatever we've decided to call them. They just kind of are. So in some ways they're completely uncomparable, but in other ways they're actually quite comparable by the way people are expected to behave within them. So the brief was, I got some participants from both providers and users of Workspace. Actually got only 17 participants because I wanted this to be a mega rich, super qualitative deep dive. So it wasn't about thousands of people doing a questionnaire for me or hundreds of people doing a questionnaire. It was a really open, super deep kind of dive. So got them in 2 different settings around a table and gave them an open brief. Okay, what matters to you about Workspace? Not necessarily your workspace, just Workspace, as open and as almost bland as I could make the question. And I gave them some prompts. What helps you? What hinders you? What delights you? What disgusts you? And I said, this is about you and Workspace in general. So you can be here, where we are now, or you can be anywhere you like. I really don't mind. I'm just interested in what you've got to say. And you might want to talk to me about stuff, proper physical stuff, Or you might want to talk to me about the more symbolic side of it. You know, what matters in terms of what is it about friends and stuff like that. But what I tried to do was, I sort of firmly believe that you can't ever strip out the bias, but I tried to keep it as absolutely neutral as possible. So I always had like opposite words, so I was never trying to lead one way or the other, if that makes sense. So the overall approach, 2 work settings, this sole occupancy prop co in London and this very collaborative share co down in London. 17 participant volunteers, providers and users. This open brief, what matters to you. And then so what I did, the technique was called participant-led photography. So I basically said, look, everybody's got one of these, and this, you know, they're like attachments to our hands now, aren't they? It's not unusual to have a phone in your hand. So how about you collect a suite of images for me which represent what matters to you about Workspace? Take 5, take 4, take 10, probably don't take 200 because we'll struggle to talk about all of them, but take a small number that sum up what you'd like to talk about. And that's all I want. And send them to me in advance and they'll form the basis of the conversation. So I recorded them. So that technique is called participant-led photography. I can't control what's going to get talked about. And then we just had some conversations. They started with, which one of these do you want to talk about first? And where do we go from there, kind of stuff. That looks really interesting. So what's going on in that photograph? There's a plate of scones there. Is this photo about the plate of scones or is it about the teapot that's next to them? What's going on with all of that? And the conversations went everywhere. So in a nutshell, it was think about what matters. It was grab your shots on camera phones. It was let's have a chat about it. And then once I've summarised what I think you're talking about, is that representative of our conversation? And everybody said, do you know what? This was a really interesting, enjoyable kind of approach. Even the folks that Workspace was their bread and butter, or even if they were talking about a workspace that they designed a couple of years ago, they were going, do you know what? It was really valuable to revisit that. So what I'd say at this point is if you ever get yourself into a workspace conversation, or you want to learn more about what matters for you guys or for your people or in response to something that's changing in your workspace, this is a really powerful exercise. And it's worth doing because you learn so much about this quickly. And people get really engaged. It's quite nice. And it's that sums up for me why this sort of approach is important. This was one of the participants who was grumbling about the way they were consulted for their actual workspace change. And it's like, well, if you're just going to ask me if an office is too hot or too cold, well, I'm not going to tell you whether the office fosters a creative environment or not. You're not asking me the right question. And it was basically saying, give me more opportunity to express what's important about space, and then we can make space really powerful. So, where am I getting to? What's going on? Oh, the computer's on a go slow. So when you ask people to take photographs of workspace, in terms of what matters to them, you get pictures like that. You get all sorts of stuff. And it's really instantly interesting, isn't it? And it's not about the sort of stuff you might have predicted. You might have predicted a computer screen in a meeting room and desks piled high with bits and bobs. I always tell the story of this tree at this point. This was a pilot participant, and they were saying that tree is 2/3 of my walk home. Because when I get to that tree, if I haven't stopped thinking about work, that's my visual cue, that's my sort of symbolic prompt to lift my head up, start looking around me, start enjoying the park that I'm about to walk through, rather than keeping thinking about the day job. So it's kind of a message to sort of say there's a work-life balance involved in all of this, which I thought was quite interesting when you ask somebody about workspace. So you're starting to get an idea, I guess, of the depth of insights that might you get. Now, talking of depth of insights, this was one of my first stabs at trying to make sense of it. It's a very exciting slide, isn't it? So what you've got is you've got PropCo across the top, and you've got ShareCo across the bottom, and then you've got providers on your left and users on the right. And what I wanted to do was capture all of the things that were getting discussed in both as well. So this is me trying to filter Okay, so what have we got? We've got something like 130 photos from these 17 participants. We've got 900 recorded interview minutes. I ended up with about 170,000 transcribed words. The data set was just phenomenal, right? And so this is me trying to say, these are the themes that are going on. These people are talking about, so the providers at PropCo were particularly talking about them, and the providers at ShareCo were talking about those things, but both sets of providers were talking about that stuff. And when you sort of simplify it and make the coding a bit more straightforward, you start to see some of these things going on. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to, in a slightly turgid way, talk you through all of those different themes, because I think that'd be quite dull. But what I'm going to try and do is show you 3 key findings, if that's all right. So 3 general things to say at this point. Okay, if you were going to sort of say, of all of that stuff, how do you group it even more high level? Well, workspace as a conceived principle, the things we're trying to achieve by doing workspace is certainly, that's one umbrella. Another umbrella is how we actually live within workspace, how we experience it. And then another umbrella, and there's quite a different umbrella, is actually stuff that's beyond the workspace. So if you say to people what matters about workspace, one significant group of my responses was actually not workspace related at all, which I think says something quite interesting in itself. So let's have a look at some of those. So 3 key findings. First one is quite a visual one. This is the fancy pictures promoting PropCo, taken by PropCo and the design firm that did it, who I've anonymised as Design and Build Co, D&B Co, right? So that's the shiny stuff for brochures. That's the impressive workspace. Notice how many people there are in that workspace. The difference between space and place that I was getting at. This is a very space-loaded kind of representation. This was one of the providers involved in that commission. This was their suite of photographs, their little montage that they put together for me. And they didn't just take a set of photos like I asked them to. They arranged it in sort of almost a narrative arc from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. The beginning of the day being woken up by the son saying, will you read me a story before I go to school, Dad? To getting back at 9 o'clock when the same boy was already in bed and missed story time. So this kind of lived experience of what we actually go through, how much travel photographs. There's a dog in the bag in that photograph on the tube. And the guy was saying, there's a dog in the bag. And do you know how many people smiled when they were surrounded on the tube by this little dog in a bag? Nobody. And he's like, he stood there staring at the dog, and there's a dog in the bag. Why is nobody responding to this? Conference images where received wisdom about workspace is being played out. All the reasons why we should do things better and the right solutions, the way to do them. And this idea that we're busy designing workspaces that people are in for probably less time than we actually kind of acknowledge, because they're working elsewhere or they're trying to be elsewhere. And yet we have this thing in the industry, this holy grail of workspace that we're trying to achieve. So quite powerful insights from somebody on the provider side, just from one participant. Okay, the second sort of significant finding is this notion that we can make choices about how to do workspace in terms of how we provide it. So this guy is a French Marxist socialist philosopher called Henri Lefebvre, who lived for the best part of the 20th century, was very activist, was involved in kind of triggering or empowering student resistance and rebellion and essentially riots in the 60s. Really quite an enigmatic character. And he wrote a book in 1974 called The Production of Space, where he basically said that social space is a social product, kind of that idea about space and place. They can only be social because of people being involved. That makes sense. social space is a social product, and because of that, it's inherently political. Now, this guy's a Marxist, right? So he's got something quite particular from a political perspective to say. But he talks about how capitalist spaces, so the systems that we're in, we're encased within a capitalist system. He talks about how you can only dominate people and sort of oppress people in those settings. So he's really quite critical of kind of corporate organisational workspace. But he sketches this thing in the book in 74, and it was written in French. It didn't get a translation until 91. And when it did get a translation, all of a sudden you start getting these little academic ripples in the more sort of sociological areas. Up until that point, it was almost unregistered. But he comes up with this model called the spatial triad. And he's trying to link conceived space, how we think about space, how we represent space, the sort of world of designers. Perceived space, how we live space, how we move around space, how we experience it with our bodies. And lived space, how we sort of viscerally experience space. He came up with this framework to try and unite them. And he says, you might want to try that to understand your space better. But he never said how. He just sketched it out, and then he was like, yeah, use that. And everybody since then who's worked with Lefebvre has kind of been going, okay, so this triad, how are we going to apply this triad? How are we going to work it? So I thought that would be quite interesting to play with. Now, I wrote an article, not a particularly big one, for a little sort of industry journal called Work and Place that came out a month or so ago. So if you like the sound of this, and if you want to learn a little bit more about Henri Lefebvre and my findings in that direction, there's a link to it at the end. I won't speak too much about that now. But And so yes, that's kind of like the headline that came out in Work and Place. But essentially, what we've got with these two cases is we've got different relationships of these four Cs. So up at PropCo, we've got this interesting relationship between control and change. So it's all about systems, protocols, agile protocols, rules for how to use the space, with a view to making people much more empowered in the way they work within the space. So it's weird because it's like we're controlling you to be more empowered. And Lefebvre would call that, according to my analysis, Lefebvre would say that's a dominated workspace. Whereas down at ShareCo, you've got what Lefebvre would call an appropriated workspace. And it's slightly fancy language, and I can't find a better way of expressing it just yet, because it's the sort of terms that he uses. But essentially, this is all about community. The lived experience is all about user community at its heart. Even though they're both essentially quite agile spaces, but they're doing completely different things. And so, that's kind of what I've said. So, up here in terms of the findings, you've got systemic stuff, protocols, how we should be doing space being sort of foregrounded. And you've got users talking about how they respond to that, often with a little bit of gentle rebellion. Well, if I'm only allowed one box to put my stuff in, I've got another box hidden somewhere, and they don't know about that. That kind of human kind of resistance creeping in. Whereas at ShareCo, you've got this foregrounded narrative from everybody about the power of the community, about this is what we're here for, we're here to help each other. Now, admittedly, it's a co-working space, and so the ethos of the space is it's a co-working space. It's about that co-working cross-organisational benefit. But you don't get agile being discussed. You get this idea of the space is designed with that in mind. And there's almost an anti-management approach. If you've got nobody to turn to when something's wrong, well, how do you solve it? Well, that sounds to me a bit like the scrum that you were talking about beforehand. If you're all in a room together, have I used that term right? Have I just ballsed it up? Not bad? All right. So I was listening. So it's that kind of, if you've got no escalation channel, well, how do you solve it? Well, you need to solve it. That's what it's all about. So my sort of phraseology at this point is PropCo was kind of about space making. It was and think back to that definition, space plus culture equals place. Space making is all about managing facilities. It's all about the terms of my job. Whereas ShareCo, in my kind of analysis, had achieved, and I didn't expect this, I didn't expect to find sort of two Lefebvrean alternatives, if you like. But I found this evidence of, instead of it being space making, it actually being about the people, it about being place making and enabling communities, which kind of blew me away a bit when I saw that kind of happen. Still got to write the damn thing up, but by the by. So the third key finding is what everybody talks about. And this is where some of the stuff which is beyond the workspace really starts to come in. So real notions of well-being. Okay, so having a choice, but also having the autonomy to choose and having enough options without it being too overcrowded. Okay, that's still within the workspace. Cake, if I can tell you the number of times that cake and beer and coffee came up in the conversations, well, it does, right? Because food is a really human thing. Okay, so the power of food and drink, the power socially of food and drink, the importance of getting out of the office, the importance of taking as long as you can to get to work, choosing a route through London where you could see more sky, run along a canal rather than taking the super direct route, taking a break at lunchtime, going out for walking meetings. None of this trendy biophilia stuff, none of this, no sort of fancy terminology, just that human getting outside and doing some exercise with friends stuff was everywhere. And it kind of links into the challenge of the work-life boundary, particularly down in London with the big commutes, although I'm sure it's no different in other locations. But how the encroachment of life and work and how you navigate that boundary, and also feeling like you're making a difference, feeling like you're involved in socially responsible activities that are over and above the day job, or that the day job is all about. These were the things that people chose to talk about when I asked them what mattered about workspace, which I thought was really interesting. So where does that get us to? Well, in terms of implications, I'm going to go a bit kind of Hertzberg's motivation theory on you here. Have you seen the sort of the launchpad kind of idea? So if you go on business balls, every great university teacher's sort of default kind of go and have a look on business balls and you'll kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about here. So Hertzberg's motivation theory is there's certain things which are table stakes. And if they're wrong, there's going to be a problem, but getting them right isn't really going to change anything. So that's like your launch pad, okay? And then the stuff that will really get us off the launch pad, they're the real genuine motivators. So a classic Hertzberg would be pay is a table stake. Something's desperately wrong if pay isn't right, but just pay won't transform your motivation for that job. Does that make sense? Is that all right? Not a fan of these sort of old, simple models, but it helps kind of explain this bit. So lots of the things I was finding, I would say, the within workspace stuff, the stuff that's the core of facilities management, you think about it in this way, that's just essential. That's table stakes stuff. That's stuff that we should be thinking about irrespective. What we want to be thinking about is how we get off that launch pad. And this is a quote from a participant who is incredibly passionate about social responsibility. It's about not being drones in the workplace. It's about feeling like you're making a contribution. Okay, we are human beings. We are not just workers. And so the real thing, this is me thinking about what facilities management as a profession, as an industry should be talking about. It's not just about what happens within four walls. It's about what we as organisations are doing and what we as FM are enabling for our organisations, actually beyond those walls. There's a lot of stuff which we really don't consider important, but perhaps if we did, it might change the conversation. And it's this idea that, if all you're doing when you come to the office is admin, because you've already solved the problems or you've had the brain waves, where do you get your best ideas? Where do you get your best ideas? Where do you like to think? Got a funny feeling it's not at a desk. I've got a funny feeling it's either with people, on a run, on a walk, walking the dog, shower in the morning, get lots of my ideas. How am I going to present tonight in Leeds? Shower in the morning, it's always a good way to get your answer. Okay? So if an office is just an administrative function and yet that's the centre of everything, that's not quite right. So that leads to ideas like, well, actually, every one of us has got our own unique, what Felsted would call a workscape. And it might involve different locations for different things. It might involve a car, it might involve a library. how do we as a profession, as facilities management, enable our workforce to think in those terms and be equipped to work in those terms? And Felsted's got nothing to do with facilities management. That's one of the beauties of this study. I tried to stretch beyond some of that conventional wisdom stuff. And it's not just that these are locations, it's that they're meaningful networks. They make sense to me to allow me to do what I want to do. And we've all got different ones. We've all got particular things that we like doing. So it's more than just mobility in the workspace. That reference there, that picture, has anybody seen Dave Coplin's RSA Animate about reimagining work? If you haven't, so Dave Coplin, CIO, Chief Envisaging Officer, CEO at Microsoft. Okay, so he's kind of on platforms preaching about the future of Microsoft, but in a non-software-y way, in a non-tech way. He's talking about the future of work. And there's this fantastic RSA Animate where he basically talks us through all the thinking that's got us to where we are with workspace and how it could be so much better. There's a link to that at the end as well. So do watch that if you fancy learning a little bit more, because it's a really interesting, there's lots of tech references in it as well, so it's quite good. So for me, it's kind of how do we get past this conventional ideas about space? How do we challenge boundaries? How do we create those alternative conversations and actually push towards, using this kind of wisest is he who knows how much he doesn't know, sort of Socratic wisdom. How do we get past some of the solutions we think we've got and actually open up possibility for others? And there are lots of people who've kind of thought about this stuff along the ages. None of this is particularly new, and this is the really sad thing for me. None of this is particularly new. We just seem to be locked in a mindset. And one of the mindsets is it always needs to be tidy and clear desks. Managing facilities is kind of this kind of notion, and we've got to avoid this stuff. And if we've got this stuff, it's bad. But what happens if that stuff, and it's not just about tidy desks or not, but what happens if that stuff is actually really important for place? And all we're trying to do is almost oppress place in favour of tidy space. What's going on there? So that's enough of me prattling on, I think, for one evening. So what I thought we'd do as a last bit, and hopefully this will promote a much more talky bit to the session, just this comparison of what you understand to be agile and what I understand to be agile. And I've got a particular question for you, but I'm just to sort of set the scene, right? Where does agile come from in my world? Well, I said I was going to shut up and I forgot I had this slide. I'm sorry. A really nice Scandinavian academic called Jurien van Meel wrote this paper called The Origins of New Ways of Working in 2011. And the premise, the bombshell, is new ways of working as a term has been around for pretty much 40, 45 years. Okay? It was promoted as new ways of working then, and it's still getting touted as new ways of working now. And he cites, you kind of go, okay, so where was the original source? And the one that Van Meel gets to was this study by Allen and Gerstberger in 1971. IBM, they did a non-territorial office experiment. This is their language, non-territorial office. And phrases, nomenclature comes in and out of fashion. It's quite interesting to watch how language changes. Basically, so what I've done is I've pulled out in that green, I've pulled out some key stuff. IBM project engineers they were made to move somewhat reluctantly into radically new space, and the idea was improve and increase the sharing of problems and experience. And the brief was you are empowered basically to position yourself wherever you can work most effectively at a given time. A range of different work settings, choose from a variety of desks, workbenches, a quiet area, even a total quiet area, and the managers were involved as well. So it was status free. So the managers give up the private rooms, they're in there with the workforce. Now, if I hadn't told you where that came from, and I'd said read that, you wouldn't have said it was from 71, would you? That could have been a description of a modern agile project or something that we're aspiring to as an organisation as something progressive. And what Allen and Gerstberger did was they studied this for a year. They did weekly questionnaires, they did pretty much semi-permanent observations, they even had a control group. So Nobody can say that wasn't proper science, right? Not like my weird experiment with 17 participants. This was a big longitudinal study. And they found some of the issues that we always find. You know, in environments like that, people have a tendency towards wanting to personalise their desks, maybe as a last bastion of territory. But once they actually get into it, quite often there's a don't ever fence me in again. I've seen the light. I love this. I've never been able to collaborate as much as I've been able to collaborate. So agile, in spatial terms, using the nomenclature as sort of accurately as I can, been around for a while, right? So my question to you guys, you folks, is the stuff that you do, what environmental conditions, and I've tried to be a bit careful with my wording, so I mean space, but I also mean more than space. What stuff goes along with space? What environmental conditions best enable you to do what you do? And what I thought what might be quite nice is just for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just turn to the person next to you, 2s or 3s, and just have a bit conversation. You tell them I teach you, can't you? Have a bit conversation about it, because then the room volume will go like this and everybody have a chance to speak. So just have a go. Okay, folks. I should have used the little clappy thing there, shouldn't I? So I've got off. This is the challenge between facilitating and chairing, and I've got off. I know you want to get down the pub, so, but the conversation kind of went like that at that point. So give me some headlines then.
Noise.
What is good or bad?
Bad.
Oh, is it always bad? Types of noise, variety. Right, variety of noise or variety of spaces?
Well, a variety of situations, yes, both.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
Can I just speak to that? In this book here, it says that at 70 decibels, it's good for creative work. At 55, it's good for, I will write back again and positive facility manager. But 55 is good for other types of work, but over 85 is good for anything.
Okay.
I would agree with that. That's what I do.
So some noise of a particular type, but not too much noise. And of course, horses for courses, right? You might absolutely hate it, but I might absolutely love it.
There's just one really loud guy.
Now, is this noise or is this a particular? See, it's interesting. There's some cultural stuff that goes with that kind of noise and distracting noise. Yeah. Okay. Any others? Headlines.
You need to be able to put stuff up everywhere. If you can't put your whiteboards up or anything like that, or posters or whatever, it's
Yeah.
a depressing environment.
Yes.
And
So,
really
so when you say be able, do you mean have space to or feel like you can?
Like, get yelled at for it.
Ah, see, that's about control, isn't it?
Yeah.
And change as well. I think for me, the nicer spaces they constantly change, so the space is different now than it was a year ago.
Okay.
And I think that, like for instance, here, I know this kind of conversation is happening here at the moment,
Yeah.
I think a little bit, because of the nature of the place and the budget that is under. But for me, that's quite nice, the fact that every week it changes a little bit and there's not a lot of money to spend, but people are adapting.
So one of the things that they had at Shareco that one particular participant was incredibly motivated by was it was a lot of CNC design in this space. They were the architects that were involved very big on sort of open source. Is it called Google Draw Up, Markup, something? SketchUp, yes, that one. Kind of shared furniture designing, almost like CAD light sort of stuff. And there was a quote board, which every week the quote changed, and they'd made a point of changing those sorts of things to, and they're often like TED Talk quotes and stuff like that. I was going to say something else there. Can't remember what it was.
One of the things I always like about my daughter's school and primary schools is they constantly need to change every time you go. They create artwork and you go and see it, and then 3 months later when you go, it's different.
Different again.
You can't possibly store all that production, so it changes implicitly.
Sure. Okay. Other headlines?
So over here, we had this conversation about does open office space scale?
Right.
So if you're down to one,
Yes.
it's very isolated.
Yeah.
If you get to a team level,
Yeah.
open space,
Yeah.
collaborates. When it gets too big, it all breaks down and goes all pear-shaped.
So
So this is where you're agile, and I'm speaking on behalf, but our agile might be compatible.
There's quite an
Doesn't
insight
scale
there.
that big.
Yeah, and I think there's an idea. There's an umbrella idea or theme that sits above both of those. Which have you ever heard of? Ricardo Semler wrote a really famous book called Maverick. So a Brazilian a Brazilian organisational owner, inherited a company from his father, and sort of turned it on its head from a management perspective. And one of his rules was, once we get to something about 113 or something like that, if the factory gets any bigger, we build a new factory. And
150.
it's the what?
Law of 150.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
So the idea about communities and whatnot. So this guy's actually saying we don't just grow, we build a new factory and we start again. And that takes me. So my days when I was looking after call centres at Orange in the early noughties, the communities were 7 groups of 14. And it's interesting because when academics talk about call centre environments, they talk about them with sort of venomous hate and how the people are oppressed and all of that stuff. Tell you what, they didn't seem particularly like they weren't enjoying themselves at Orange. They seemed to be having a whale of a time, vandalising all my furniture with all sorts of displays and whatnot, and all of that stuff that they did. But yeah, they were called communities, which I thought was really interesting. So yeah, scalability is important. There's a thing about human scale design. You know, if you design a triple height atrium for people to walk into, that sends a very different message. It might send a message of grandeur and prestige, but it's not very human scale, and it's doing something else with the space. A couple more before we move on.
We were talking about it's really important that people can work together well, so we came up with a couple of different ideas. And mine was about the walls and that kind of thing, that
Yeah.
when you as a community, as a group, as a team, you're working together and you're moving things around and it's very visual, and that's really important. And Matt was talking about having people to talk to who are in your specialism, or to be able to go and talk to if they're not part of your multidisciplinary team, but you can, just having those communicating.
Okay, so I'm going to say a couple of things off the back of that, and that's reminded me about what I wanted to say in response to the other thing. So at Shareco, everything was in use, but it wasn't just in use they'd made lots of spaces, lots of wall space, lots of whiteboard stuff. There was an ethos of it's all right. So there was just dry wipe on the windows. It was like, well, yeah, but that's a surface. We can work on that surface. Why wouldn't we? And it just blew me away, the kind of level of empowerment to say, we respect it and we love this place, but fundamentally we need to thrive within it. They're my words, they're not their words, but it's that kind of thing. So it's partly having that spaces, but it's also being empowered to do that stuff, to feel that you can. And that ought to be a question to reflect on. Is that your sort of workspace? Is that your sort of organisation? Go on.
There's a place in Leeds, I haven't worked there, but you're not allowed to touch the glass, otherwise you need to send an apology to people and shit like that.
There you go.
Yeah, and the thing is you want to be able to fucking go around and touch glass, you know what I mean?
I bet you want to doubly touch it when you're not allowed to, right? Because it's like, don't press that big red button.
Yeah.
Don't press it.
You really like texture and you love being able to touch things, and being told you can't touch it is just such an oppressive, depressing thing.
Okay, so that's kind of design. There's got to be a commodity thing going in there because they value their space almost over and above your people by the sounds of it. Because it's like, don't touch that. You're not allowed to. So lots of the things that have sort of started to surface in some of the points you've made about being able to choose where you work, being able to use lots of space, being able to get away from that noisy bugger who puts me off what I'm trying to focus on. All right. If I was to say to you literally the one rule that you might have, that you might issue tomorrow to your workforce is, choose where you want to sit and go and sit there. And if you've got a problem, if you find a problem, sort it out like an adult. Can you imagine what that might do to our workspaces? Okay. What?
I'll be at home.
And what would be wrong with that if you were accountable for your outcomes?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, we're not talking about space, we're talking about organisational culture, right? And that's why they're so closely interlinked. So that slide there was just to kind of say, reflect upon the things that you were thinking about, you were talking about. Were they tangible things? Were they more intangible, symbolic, meaningful things? Were they spatial things, or were they more cultural things? And just in that really brief 5-minute feedback, I think there's been sort of bits of all of those come up in the conversation. So I do like the revolution will not be televised, and this is a tiny little quote that pops up in a live version that apparently Gil Scott Heron riffed on the spot. Just kind of made it up in the middle of a song one time. So this lovely thing about seeing things differently is where it all starts. And for me, that's kind of a bit of a mantra for me. If we can think about space differently, then it would be amazing, the sorts of things that we might achieve. So there's a bit of shelf development for you. Just a couple of highlights. So Dave Coplin, that link to the Reimagining Work RSA Animate, if you want to watch it, there's the link. Shameless self-promotion, that little article that I wrote for Work and Place. If you want to read more about Henri Lefebvre, then have a little read there. Tells you a bit more about my study. Now, the other two in red, I've highlighted those because I thought you might quite like them. Harrison and Durish, two papers wrote 10 years apart. Harrison, I think, was Xerox and Durish was Apple. So you've got two software-y types thinking about space. So if you are of an academic bent or you like a nice challenge read at bedtime rather than a nice biography or something, then those two papers, which are readily findable online quite easily, and if not, by all means, just hit me up and I'll send you a copy. They're quite thought-provoking from a sort of software-y, spacey kind of perspective. And they nail lots of the things that I've been talking about, probably an awful lot more eloquently than me. So, pub time?